again, thank people who haven't been here throughout, among them Leah Van Wey for helping us think about this conference and organizing it. Leah Van Wey, who will be chairing this session, is professor of environment and society and sociology at Brown University. She has worked many years in Brazil, and she is a social demographer and environmental social scientist who studies population change, socioeconomic development, and environmental change in Brazil. And I want to thank her for something that she did. I went on sabbatical in 2010, 2011, and came back, and Leah came up to me in a meeting of the faculty and said, you know, we have this amazing Department of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies, but we need to kind of build Brazil across the disciplines. Would you help me do that? And so we came up with the idea of the Brazil Initiative, and for 2 years we just had a program and a manifesto, and we would take it to every single event and talk about it. And then a series of wonderful things happened that resources came our way. We were able to build the Brazil Initiative and do it. So it really, she was the one who kind of pushed me to kind of take the lead in doing this, and I want to thank her for doing that.
It was really effective. All I had to do was say, let's do it, and you did all the work.
Right. That's my kind of neuroses, I guess. So she'll be inviting the panelists. This is, again, a 2-hour session. We want to kind of keep to the session today because people have other plans afterwards. So Leah Van Wey. And then people who have just arrived who need translations, we have machines or aparelhos to do the translations. Se alguém precisar o aparelho para tradução, tem aparelhinhos ali para você usar, tá?
All right, thank you very much. I am going to take the prerogative to say 2 minutes about why we have to have a session about environment in a conference that's about the future of human rights and autonomy and democracy in Brazil. So as we heard this morning, nature is not simply a set of resources that we are using to further our economy, to further social development. Nature, it has to be deeply integrated into social life. So throughout the world, and in Brazil especially, people are deeply connected to their environments in a way that environmental protection is not simply about environmental protection. It is about the protection of human autonomy and human dignity in linked socio-ecological systems. And so this is, to me, the reason why we can't have a conference about the future of Brazil without having a piece about environment. And then I wanted to frame why I think this is about more than just Brazil, and why the message that's coming out of Brazil is important for the rest of the world and needs to be amplified. And so the first reason is really the reason that's coming from the ground. So the struggle that we see for environmental protection and for the lives of the people that we have in rural areas, in environmentally dependent areas in Brazil, is about the future of social systems and ecological systems and the dramatic social diversity and biological diversity that are inextricably linked in Brazil. So for basic human rights reasons, this is an important message that has to be amplified throughout the world. The second reason is really coming from a global perspective. The carbon stocks that are embodied in Brazil's forests and savannas are so large that if we do not protect them, if that carbon is released into the atmosphere, we will see dramatic and catastrophic environmental change that will affect communities from Brazil to Bangladesh to Boston. So from even a purely self-interested perspective, what happens in Brazil matters for all of us around the world. And then the third reason is a reason from the ground again, but not a reason from the ground in Brazil, a reason from the ground all around the world. So Brazil is an incredible model of how social movements incorporate environment, incorporate ecological realities, and are able to imagine futures that link environmental protection and environmental amelioration with social protection and social betterment. And this is a lesson that all of us from around the world need to hear. And so that's the reason why I think we need to amplify all of the messages that we hear today. So that's my quick framing of why we have to have this session here. And then I want to turn over as quickly as possible then to the people who actually are going to bring those messages that we're going to be able to amplify. So the first speaker on our panel is Ayala Lindabeth Ferreira, who holds a degree in pedagogy from the Federal University of Pará and a specialization in agrarian residence. And she's been an MST militant for more than 15 years, where she's been responsible for many political and organizational tasks, including coordinating the MST Internationalist Brigade in Cuba in 2008 and 2009. And she's currently a member of the MST National Board and coordinates the human rights sector. Do you want to speak from here or there? Para cá?
Our development as human beings in profound dialogue with the space, with agricultural space, and with all other human beings in a general way. I have to confess that I did not organize any material, even when I came here and even when I stayed a few days here already. Because we are coming from a very intense movement of struggle, especially peasant struggles and movements of indigenous people. The Red April, which we started, which is something that we started 23 years ago. We call it a week of struggle or a month of struggle, and we're coming from out of that warmth, that heat. And so we're recognizing our brave comrades, those who are fighting for agrarian reform, those who are fighting in defense of the territory. Those are the people who inspire the reflections that I want to share with you today. I also wanted to say, thank you. I also wanted to say that it's not an individual reading or interpretation. It's not personal. What we've asked for in the MST and the Landless Peasants movement is a kind of a collective intellectual effort, a process of reflection and self-reflection on what we've been doing as a social movement. And so to a certain extent, those are also reflections which I have heard on the other panels before we started with our panel. So I wanted, in that sense, to bring three things in my 10 or 15 minutes that I could bring so that I could put it before us for debate. The first idea is the effort that MST has done to explain to our allies and to Brazilian society why MST is considered the enemy on the political scene and the institutional scene. It's considered an enemy in our country. For us, it makes us very uncomfortable that sometimes when we're listening to some of our comrades, they seem to be saying, oh, you are a target. So we stop to think, when in life have we not been a target ever since we've been fighting for agrarian reform in Brazil? It's a kind of a concern that we have. We've been trying to say it's not just MST, but all the movements that are struggling for land, for defense of their territory, the territory that comprises the biodiversity of our region. All of us are enemies, not of a government, but of a regime that's organized on the logic of capital. So when we talk about that logic in the Brazilian society, we're talking about a construction, something that has been lasting or going on for hundreds of years, a society that was constructed profoundly unequal, profoundly based on a class structure of inequality, which is based on three fundamental pillars. And that's why we're considered to be enemies. First one is to affirm the fact that ownership of large pieces of land has been the way that one class has been posted or made hegemonic over the other. And that one is a class that has a certain color, and it does come from colonization. Thank you. With that structure, which reaffirms this kind of feeling of hatred and that kind of orientation that says we need to destroy the movements who are fighting for for land and for their own territory. That's an imposition. It's an imposition of one class over another based on color of skin. So that is to substitute a slave society from the past to be translated into a society today in a very brilliant form. Secondly, we are a society and a structure which every time people who were disinherited from their land or from other means that are necessary for them to survive, every time they dare to struggle, every time they struggle, they are harshly repressed. So we have a society that is anti-popular against the people, and that's happened along the hundreds of years of our existence. So that imposition is what justifies the hate, which is not expressed just in the way the government behaves, but also in a hegemonic system in our society, and also it's taking place at a worldwide scale, as people have said before today. So that order is expressed by these terms. So we are a popular force, that we have a consciousness of ourselves as a class, and we faced up to this structure of inequality and the production of a class society. And we've been trying for I don't know how many years to build the basis for a model, the model that we're trying to bring now that's counter-hegemonic at a time, at a moment when these other forms are not accepted. So that's the first idea that I wanted to put out there. I don't feel myself to be a member or a part of an organization like MST. I don't feel like I'm alone for the emancipation of the working class and for subjects who live and struggle in the Brazilian countryside. So that's why we're very much in agreement with the Black cause, with the cause of indigenous people, all the other subjects who have to fight against those three pillars which sustain inequality in our country. The second idea that I wanted to bring, and for my conclusion, I wanted to call, I'm not speaking in a positive way, but I'm talking about the Bolsonaro phenomena in our society. What I wanted to say to you is the way we interpret it or the way we read it, we're not talking about something that happened in an election, right away over the last year. And we're not just talking about the coup that took place. We're talking about a cycle that has lasted about 10 years, from 2008 to 2018, which has three characteristics, which is the limit or the extent to which we can translate this short but also long 10-year cycle. It's been long because we've had very difficult consequences for us. It's been short, but it's been hard, these 10 years. The first one is that we've had difficulties interpreting the real nature of the crisis of capital that we've been facing, that our society has been facing this crisis in a very calm way, as if it were a crisis that wouldn't affect many people, that it would be just a small thing that wouldn't profoundly affect our society. And that's because the option that was taken to confront this structural problem was to increase the consumption of mass goods to get more credit to people in a general form, so that you could have the refrigerator of the year, the car of the year. The state itself incentivized this by means of providing credit. And that was also linked to what we thought would be a wave of criticism of the structure of capital. So an economy based on profoundly increasing the access to cars and meat commodities for the whole world. And that affected directly the social movements who were fighting for the cause of territories, the traditional territories, the maroon territories, rural territories. So what happened was land acquired a very high value for the interests of capital, and then there was no room left for agrarian reform. So that's an equivocal thing that we need to organize, we need to analyze in a very comradely, brother and sisterly way between us. The second thing is the cycle that was lasting over 10 years, or was constructed over 10 years, has something to do with the process of our capacity to underestimate how the dominant class could pull itself back together. I've spent a lot of months reflecting. We're asking, how is it that agribusiness has gained so much, and that has become allied with the courts, and that has been allied with industry in Brazil? how can that become an ally of the military? How could that become an ally of the parliament, of the mass media that they are all benefiting from in this cycle, this neoliberal development cycle? So that's the development that the Bolsonaro effect or phenomena is a result of those class interests that came together, and that this is reproduced cyclically in our society and in our midst. And it has resulted in a kind of a fragilization, making more fragile the democracy that we have. And the third point, my third and last point of the ideas that we wanted to share with you has to do with our difficulty in accomplishing. I'm sorry about the microphone. We have a habit of standing up and speaking. If we sit, we feel tied down. So I'm used to standing up and talking, but it's difficult for me to talk with that microphone while I'm standing up. So I have to speak with this other microphone. So the third was our difficulty during these last 10 years, was a difficulty of us understanding that there were certain concerns that were in the street, and that those could be concerns that were popular. Those popular concerns ended up being captured by others that were not in their interest. Those people who went to the street to question the difficulties that they had in living in the city, the poorly planned cities, the cities that were planned not for poor people to live in. Everything is difficult. Transport is difficult. Security is difficult. Housing is difficult. So this means that those people who took to the streets were not well understood by us, and then they were captured by other forces, and they became part of what was captured by the Bolsonaro phenomenon. Therefore, my dear comrades, I'm speaking with assurance when I say that, because I've figured that out over the last two days, that we are companions and comrades. I wanted to affirm that we have to be very careful. We have to think not to think that Bolsonaro is an individual who is weak. We have to contest his ideas, because even a weak person, he wasn't exactly the ideal person to express what has been happening for the past 10 years. But the groups that comprise his government, maybe they don't understand, and maybe they sometimes fight. We shouldn't underestimate that. Despite this, these are elements which characterize this government over the last 100 years. The project that they bring is one that has been being constructed for a long time. It's a rearticulation of capital at the global level to struggle, to fight against us, and to continue this hegemonic model of a small group of people who have extraordinary profit and wealth. So we should not underestimate and think that this is just an individual project. This is a project about a model that has some problems, and they're continuing those problems so that they can continue to reproduce the model. They're correcting those problems. They can reproduce the model. So it's in that sense that I want to enter into the question or the platform of the environment. That project, those subjects, coordinated by one individual, but it could be another person who coordinated it, because it's a logic. I'm not going to repeat. People have already said that. They said that the state has to diminish its role. You have to take back the rights of workers. That's what's in fashion now. And those things that have to do with our role in the countryside, which means turning the goods of nature into commodities more and more, to turning the goods that come from nature into commodities for sale. So in only 100 days, those measures that have been taken by this government go directly in that direction of turning in a kind of an irrational way, as we see it from our perspective, but they may have caused serious risks to be placed before humanity. So, for example, in Minas Gerais, it made it possible for an enterprise to be set up But after this tragedy that took place there, they still continue to make profit. It's because anything is profit for them, whether it's human lives or anything else. So in that sense, okay, I have 5 more minutes. Wonderful. Perfect. So I want to insert this so that I could say that the measures that the government is taking, in fact, to push even further this logic of turning things into commodities, and they're not doing it by accident, that these measures are being taken. These measures are to deal with 2 things, so that the space for farming in Brazil is turned into something that does not have space for us, that we're just a small part of the diversity and we're just taking up, or we are just a small part. And something worse, those who still stay on the land have to be standardized according to a kind of a capital logic. The way that they live has to be standardized. So I have to dispute this thing about people who live in the country are not modern, and if not, they don't know what to do with the land. It'll turn into favelas or ghettos in the countryside. Yeah. So people say that we in the countryside are favelas or ghettos. So they want to standardize how we live. So this existence of diversity in our country, which has been something beautiful, is something they're trying to repress. So these 2 kinds of ways of thinking are justifying what they say are the measures that the government should take. That's militarization of agriculture. And that's not to speak of the organs and the councils that were constructed just so that our people and our movements could have a space for their voice. Those places or those institutions have disappeared overnight. INCRA, which had to do with indigenous people, is now the one that's going to be in charge also of agrarian reform or agrarian measures. And it doesn't matter what kind of environmental consciousness we've had, and it will no longer be connected to that. That all of those aspects of the environment are now being coordinated by people who represent military interests or who have big businesses, agro businesses, or some of the big landowners who had been put aside, or they're now coming back. This is one of the things that we're facing. How do we deal with the military? How do we deal with people who are against agrarian reform? How do we deal with our own people who want to live outside of this logic of capitalism? So that's one thing. Changing our way of life so that agro-business can become stronger. And that would mean also that agrochemicals, poisonous agrochemicals, can come back in an uncontrolled way. Every 2 or 3 days, some other poisons, agrotoxins that have been prohibited in other countries are being brought back for legal use in our country. And all of this is following a logic of capital. So this other element about flexibility of the workforce, to make it possible to have private activities in reserves, in forests, partnerships with the American government to take care of the Amazon. And I am especially offended by the suggestion that we can't take of our own Amazon forest and that we can't deal with agriculture in our country. That's not ideal. We're going to now have partnerships with those who know how to think better about the Amazon than we do. We actually think this is a process to intensify the use of the land in the Amazon and also to put up a total impediment, an obstacle to agrarian reform. So if before we had a kind of a paralysis of what to do for this under Lula and Dilma, now we are totally blocked. Sorry, I can't hear when she moves away from the mic. So to justify a culture of violence and to justify the dead, the people who were killed in the countryside, of the minute or 2 that I left over for me, I want to share what we've called the challenges that we have for the popular sectors. in this scene, especially in from 2016, the things that were configured by the coup and then the elections. For us, for all of us in Brazil, we traced out a perspective that brought us together to figure out what should we do. It's a time. It's not a time of reflection, it's a time to do things. So first we had a discussion about what would be would we have an active resistance or would we do a strategic retreat? We took a lot of time doing this debate. For me, it seemed to be kind of fruitless. What are you thinking, I was saying, about resistance? What are you thinking about when you say strategic retreat? We're thinking about what Douglas brought this morning. We're thinking about the same kind of thing, but in a different way. We talk about the need to do grassroots work. We're also talking about that kind of resistance. We never stop doing it. Grassroots work, political and ideological education, and also processes to move forward. These two perspectives are actually saying the same thing, the education and the action. So this process has helped us to recognize whether it was the movement of popular movements or the movement of parties. It doesn't mean that we're lost. It's just that we know we have concrete limits. It's been a long time that we've been talking about the fact that we have a programmatic crisis among the popular sectors. They don't understand necessarily what we're trying to say when we say we want to destroy the logic of capital. So we have a programmatic crisis about how to bring together all these different groups, these identity groups. One element that is part of our program is that we have a crisis about organizing. We need to go more deeply into the dimensions of what is concerning the popular sectors. And we also have a theoretical crisis for us to try to define the meaning of the different words so that they can represent concretely what the struggle is about. So our challenge is not first to resolve theoretical challenges. Our first responsibility is to find a practical daily response to correspond to the practical dynamic as the way the popular sectors are placing before us their own problems. And to close, I want to say that this is an internal struggle that we're trying to do to reform to reform the struggle for agrarian reform. And what does that mean? But we're also trying to do an external effort so that we can articulate, we can link up with other forces that are out there. So we're talking about identity, but we're also talking about diversity. That's what I think about the historic processes of others, because we're a crazy mixture. If I'm talking about agrarian reform, it doesn't mean that I'm not thinking about Black people or Black movements. Yes, I'm part of the Peasants movement, but I'm also part of the Black movement. I know that I'm Black. When the same thing with the question of a women's or a gender movement. Of course, I have to see myself. It's a concrete construction of the fact that all these different platforms are actually one platform if we look at it at a total or holistic way. So we need to seek out or search for unity with others. And in that concrete construction, we need to be able to have a clear declaration about what we're doing. And not just a theoretical declaration, but a practical declaration. The struggle for rights brings us all together. The struggle for democracy brings us all together. The struggle for Lula to be free. The struggle for human rights. Let's go to that. All of these things are on the table, and we need to act on that in this conjuncture. Half of what she said. She has slides.
Okay.
Tá, a segunda pessoa que vai falar com a gente é a Elionice Conceição Sacramento, que começou seu ativismo no movimento As Gaivotas, que ela fundou na municipalidade de Salinas, que fica no recôncavo da Bahia.
And you're putting it up. And so Leo is at the forefront of campaigns at the intersection of democratization, environmental protection, gender rights, anti-racism, and human rights in the modern era. Que fala? Carol?
Since I've already been introduced, first I wanted to pay homage to the original people, the indigenous people of this land, and also the peoples of our own land. I want to ask permission from my ancestors, and I want to have the blessing of Pai Erisvaldo. I want to thank Ramon and Jim Green. Especially, I want to thank Professor Jerry Augusto and Professor Tony Boggs, who have received me, because my stay here, I needed affection and human warmth, so I'm staying with them. Having said that, I am Elionice Sacramento, as has been said. I usually say I'm a Black woman with a first name and a last name because I was taught that by Leila Gonzalez and Vilma Reis. She said Black women have to have a first name and a last name because usually by old prejudices we were called by just a first name. So I bring here in my presentation as my comrade at the table said, I'm very happy. It gives me joy to divide the panel with you. This is a meeting between the salt water of Bahia with the waters of Pará. So a union of waters of the Northeast and the North. This says a lot about whenever you have a union of the Northeast and the North. So I'm bringing here two images for the beginning to help us dialogue. One is an image of the national campaign for regulating or putting regulations for national fishing territories. This is something that we think that national fishing communities need to have. We need life, we need the mangrove, we need food, we need housing, we need to have children. We need to have adequate conditions for living and for sustaining ourselves. But I'm also bringing here another image. This is of a tragedy that was caused by capital. And what I'm doing here is bringing the contrast of what is a life in traditional modes or traditional modalities. I don't mean the old-fashioned traditional way. And what is a life that is characterized or put forward by capital. So I'm going to speak about fishing women, maroon fisher women, quilombola, maroon fisher women, justice, territorial justice, and the impact of capital on the lives of Black women. To contextualize, I want to present Conceição das Salinas, which is the community where I come from. It's a community, Salinas de Margarida is in the Recôncavo region, the south part of the Recôncavo. It's very near an island called Itaparica. It's a community that's been there about 300 years. 80% of the population lives by fishing, and also by a kind of subsistence agriculture. The municipality also provides jobs for less than 10% of the population. It's a community that has received its certificate by the Palmares Cultural Foundation. We also have the authorization for sustainable use of the territory, come from the government. Mm-hmm. We have a process, an open process still at INCRA, which is the National Institute for Settlement and Agrarian Reform, to study our territory. This is a territory that's profoundly disputed. As the music says, before rich people wanted to live on the beach and they worked where they lived. Today, the rich people don't just want to live on the beach, but they want to take their enterprises and businesses to the beach. And because of that, we and our people are systematically threatened all the time. At the municipal level, for almost a decade, more than a decade, we have an administration which is very similar to that which has recently been come into power in Brazil and in the United States. When the management or administrative threat of Bolsonaro arose, we think that Salinas de Margarida or Conceição de Salinas has a lot to say to the rest of the country about how you survive a regime like this. So I'm going to bring a little bit about the context, the general context for the movement. I am a militant in a national movement of fishermen and fisherwomen, and I'm also part of a group called the National Group of Fishing Women. I'm a coordinator of that movement. This is a movement that's been in existence for about 10 years, linking together fishermen and fisherwomen in 18 states. It's a movement to empower us to defend our territory and our way of living. It's important to always say that who are the fishermen and the fisherwomen in Brazil? To say that principally or especially because those north of Brazil, in the north and in the northeast of Brazil, we are majority Black and indigenous population. Having said that, I want to point out that the Brazilian state has as an historic debt with us. Many of us are commemorating yesterday the Holy Week. And for us, this Holy Week has an importance that goes beyond its religious importance. For us, the Holy Week has an importance for us, an economic importance. And it's also something important for our identity. I think it's important for me to say that many of us think that somehow the fish comes out of the heavens from the north. So it's important to think about who are these subjects who are carrying out this activity so that high quality food comes to the table of the Brazilian people. In this regard, even studies from hospitals and clinics say that the fisherwomen, for example, that we work from 12 to 16 hours a day. And so things like repetitive movements and other kinds of health problems, Brazilian society doesn't know about that. So we have to systematically keep repeating that we're doing that work. And for in juridical norms or in norms of the law, the presence of fishing women doesn't even exist. Before the law, fishing women don't exist. You have to look at the documents about fishing. They don't even speak of gender. So what they'll have is the traditional fisherman, and then they'll have Donna, Ms. Maria, Miss Joanne. The documents always think of us as those who are helping a companion or a husband. And that's why we have to have a husband or live with another man in order to have a guarantee of any kind of social benefits. It can be the father, the husband, the brother, but it has to be a masculine figure. And on the other hand, in practice, women, whereas men work 4 to 6 hours a day, we work 12 to 16 hours a day. And we work in all the activities that have to do with the whole chain of doing fishing, from fishing itself to beneficiating the fishing, to preparing it, to packaging it, to selling it. We do everything. So it's important to say that we are occupying or living in territories that people are very envious of. We live along rivers, we live at the seashore, and the disputes have generated conflicts in the different traditional fishing territories in all of the Brazilian states. There's not a city, there's not a fishing community, there's not a maroon fishing community where there isn't some kind of conflict with capital. For us also, we need to say, and we've had to say it many times, that the political coup against us came before the political coup that now the whole nation, the Brazilian nation, is facing. Because the so-called left government that we elected and that we helped them to construct their project, they also decreed against us certain measures were enacted by them which attacked our identity. For example, during President Dilma's government, she's a woman that we elected, we were obliged to present some kind of documentation that says whether we were fishing every day and all day. So looking at it in that way, this is the experience that we're basing what we're saying today on. Also, in the last decades, we've been facing the biggest territorial conflicts. When in Brazil, we created a ministry for fishing, we celebrated that under the Lula's government. But also that was the same government that decreed privatization of waters. So we have to ask, what good is it to have a ministry of fishing if we don't have the water where we're supposed to carry out our fishing activities? You can't have fishermen and fisherwomen without waters. I'm bringing here some examples of conflicts, local conflicts. But I'm going to do a summary. I'm doing a summary of some conflicts, but I'm also bringing here later on that if you wanted to talk about that, many other conflicts. But right now, just thinking about this particular fishing quilombo, which is Salinas de Margarida, Conceição de Salinas, here's what we have. We've had enterprises, big businesses such as Salinas Agrobusiness. We've had shrimp farming, or we call it shrimp in captivity. We've had a selling of lots on the Golden Coast. We've had a shipyard at Paraguaçu, which was one of the things that helped explode a very strong attack against traditional people in the Recôncavo region. And this was one which the Brazilian state cheated or managed to sneak by a lot of environmental laws in order to establish that shipyard. That's why I say that Brazilian democracy has been being threatened and is threatened. We've, for a long time, not been living under a democratic process. When systematically in Brazil, we haven't had the kind of process where we're consulted. We haven't had a process where the norms have been oriented or guided by something. We've had these kinds of laws and measures established by the Brazilian state without consulting with us. We've been reflecting for 10 years, more than 10 years. The fishermen and fisherwomen's movement has understood that the Brazilian state was actually one of its main enemies. So then we've also had this question of selling out lots or plots in the middle of a maroon community, in the middle of a fishing community, which is taking up 60% of the land or the territory that was for collective use. This is an enterprise or a business whose characteristics are corruption, are violence, racial and gender violence. For a certain kind of militia has characterized it. There have been crimes committed against the Atlantic forest and against the wetlands. There has been environmental, structural, and institutional racism, and there has been territorial injustice. This is a business or an enterprise which sneaked in the middle of the night into a traditional community. The municipality usurped the competence or the rights of a higher organ because the municipality had a private interest in constructing a private business. And that business was implemented using public means. That means that environmental regulations have been relaxed or made more fragile, and that has made it possible to do this kind of action. What you're seeing here are some images of that business that I was talking about. On the first photograph, you see how the community looked before that, and you see the Atlantic forest, you see the wetlands. 1 month later, after the enterprise was announced, that there would be plots sold for less than 1,000 reais. So everything was opened up, and an intense process of criminalization, making the leaders of the community into criminals, and also kind of policing the terrain so that we couldn't even get into the territories where we were born and where we grew up. Parallel to this, there was a plotting together of the official environmental organs, which guaranteed that businessmen would get ownership. People who came just less than a year ago could get the right to buy plots, and we were prohibited from entering the spaces where we produce our lives and where we produce. But this isn't something that's just happening to Conceição de Salinas or Salinas de Margarida or in the Recôncavo region. It's something that's happening all over Bahia and all over Brazil. To conclude, what are some solutions and what is the resistance that we've been doing? We've instituted a process of auto-delineation, or we ourselves are rezoning the land. We are redelineating the land that belongs to us without waiting for the state to fulfill its own role, because we've understood we can't count with the state. We've learned that. So we have to take care of ourselves. We also have instituted training processes, educational processes, like the School of the Waters, which is an initiative that we thought of and that we've been implementing. We've been implementing as the fishermen and fisherwomen's movement. What we're trying to do is to build in capabilities and competencies so that we can be our own consultants and advisors and take care of our own problems. We've also been using campaigns of information and denouncing. What we've understood is when we denounce these systematic threats that we've been facing, we become in a certain way more protected. Because if it just stays inside our community, what we call the colonialism, which is the old military style of slave owners, then they can act much more strongly and with a much stronger military force. So we denounce publicly. The national campaign to institute regulation of fishing territories, we've been trying to dialogue with the Brazilian society so that they understand the importance of fishing territories, so they understand the importance of the production that we do, our role as producers of food. And we want the society to take unto itself also, or to participate in this campaign. We've also been trying to identify strategic partners. We've been trying to strengthen our alliances with other movements. We've been intensifying our own grassroots work. And we've been trying to broaden our national and international alliances. These are the strategies we've been trying to do. So I'd like to put on the table for us some reflections for the conference. And one is, how can this important proposal to constitute an observatory, how can it contribute to the protection of the lives of maroon or quilombola fishing women in Brazil? We think that if it's going to just be an observatory, we're wondering just to observe, or is it an observatory that's going to help us think about concrete measures? What are the linkages that will be done? What are the linkages that will be built by the observatory? And finally, how does this institute or this event, what does this event think? What does this institute, this institution, Watson Institute, think about the passing over to the giving away to other people the natural resources of Brazilian people? Someone asked me to bring some symbols and some reflections, especially about, Marcia spoke about the tides, and I thought maybe I'd bring some reflections about the tides, ways that I've been thinking systematically and theoretically through the tides, through the metaphor of the tides. Thank you.
Muito obrigada. Quem vai falar por último é Paul Little, que é...
So Paul has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Brasilia. He's a specialist in Amazonian studies with a focus on the ecological relations of forest peoples and rapid land use change. He's the author of numerous books and articles on Amazonia and currently is an international consultant on policy analysis and program evaluation for socio-environmental issues. Welcome, Paul.
Quero agradecer a James e a Ramon e todos os organizadores do evento.
Of the event. I really feel honored to be in such a privileged and distinguished group and be able to work with you. So my purpose today is to elaborate what we could maybe call an agenda, a Brazilian agenda for socio-environmental rights. So I'd like to kind of start with a brief history of Brazil after the Constitution of 1988, speaking about the rise of socio-environmentalism in Brazil and the new attacks on ruralists since 2005 on the international, transnational scene and also on the Brazilian scene. And I'd like to end on it with a few reflections on what an alternative model might look like for socio-environmental governance. So socio-environmentalism in Brazil in the 80s begins with the resurgence of social movements as part of the redemocratization of Brazil, the international clamor against the deforestation of the Amazon. Two important moments were the meeting at Altamira in '79, in which the 600 Kayapo warriors were allied with the environmentalists to kind of impede the construction of a dam on the Xingu River, a big dam, and you can see, the warrior threatening this man here, and also the rubber tappers who got international support in their fight to protect their forests with the tragic murder of Chico Mendes, who became a martyr symbol for this movement. I'd like to highlight as well the advertising of the new federal constitution in 1988, which recognized for the first time rights of indigenous peoples. For the first time, they were being given legal rights to their lands and to their cultural practices. The Maroon communities also gained the right to ownership of their lands and official recognition of that, and also the establishment of the right to an ecologically balanced environment for everyone. So combining maroon communities, indigenous communities, with movements for biodiversity and conservation, and an innovative movement. One of the important movements in terms of understanding the direct connection between social diversity, in other words, various ways of living in an area, with the high rates of biodiversity. So thinking of indigenous lands and in conjunction with conservation efforts in the Amazon, these two types of territorial entities have control of 45% of the Amazonian territory. In other words, 3.5 million square kilometers. And they have a lot of biodiversity and connection with these lands. And the formalization of traditional people in terms of their use of these protected areas in a sustainable way. So here's a map of the Amazon area. In orange, you see the indigenous lands, in green, the protected lands, or the preserves, which make up this 45% that I talked about. And then this is a great victory for this movement. And it's also important to say that many of these lands are precariously established, that they're also being invaded, encroached upon, but formally they have the right to the protection of these territories. And this is a great victory. So deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon is a huge issue, and that's the area that I work on mostly. You can see that from 2004 forward, there's a distinct decrease for the next 10 years in terms of the rate of deforestation in the Amazon that in recent days and in months and years since 2015 really has started to increase again. And this is not just a victory for biodiversity, but for everyone who lives there and who's not having to see their forests cut down and their rivers polluted. And that's another great moment in terms of this movement's history. So right now, the socio-environmentalism is being harassed, is being suffering aggressions from the last 30 years of advances in terms of the environment. The reduction in deforestation rates, the protection of indigenous lands, and the expansion of environmental protection, and the role of this movement in the global environmentalist movement is now under attack. The paralysis in terms of continuing to grant recognition to these communities and their lands, and the rights that they already have are kind of being eroded as well, and murdering local indigenous leaders and rural workers. So these are two questions that have gone through that have been present in this whole event, right? How did we get to this point, and what can we do? So what I'd like to do is, from the environmentalist perspective, to understand a little bit where do these attacks come from? So obviously the ruralists occupy a place of privilege in this wave of attacks, and so I'm setting 2005 as the beginning of a new wave in which ruralists were always there. The big landowners were there, and that's been something that's clearly recognized and acknowledged. But from the beginning of the 21st century, there's been this new offensive of the ruralists, of the big landowners, and so in 2005 there's this law made that Monsanto really developed, and it was one of the great defeats of Marina Silva when she was in the Ministry of the Environment, followed by reductions in the protection of conservation groups. The great defeat in the forest code. It just got word from James that this code, which was in effect granted amnesty to these big landowners, wasn't enough. That they want to totally eliminate reserves. In other words, they want to get rid of this forest law. And then the law of biodiversity that gives preference to commercial uses, President Dilma's impeachment, and then, of course, the inauguration of Jair Bolsonaro as president. So I also think it's important to focus on the tactics that are being used. They've already been discussed here at this conference, but I think it's important for us to understand the tactics so that we can learn how to combat these things. So first, the constitutional attacks. So one of the first things that Bolsonaro's government wants is mining in indigenous lands, which is vetoed in the Constitution. So it's obviously an attack on the Constitution, the way that they want to mine in these indigenous territories. The PEC 215 is another threat that wants to remove or get rid of the process of granting recognition of indigenous ownership of lands. And the second tactic is just not following the law. In other words, the government has a responsibility to enforce the law, but one thing they're doing is to just kind of look the other way and not fulfill and not enforce the regulations that have been put forth. And this is happening in Roraima, the state of Roraima, with construction of railroads and roads to connect through the forest. They're not auditing, they're not checking up on deforestation and enforcing that. So that's another tactic that they're using. In other words, not investigating, not checking up on things to make sure that the deforestation is not happening. So they're simply doing nothing and letting people do whatever they want. Another thing is kind of trying to dissolve public policy. So in terms of environmentalism, this has been a really big issue in the first 100 days of Bolsonaro, this MP 870, which is another way of creating kind of a super ministry of agriculture, which puts in their hands the power to grant approval or to deny recognition for lands to indigenous and maroon groups. The Brazilian Forest Service and the environmental registration process. So those are all in the hands of the agro business heads. And they also want to, cut the funding for groups like the FUNAI. Our authoritarian practices, has already been mentioned here. Sonia talked about this yesterday, of the militarization of national forces for the Acampamento Livre that's going to happen next week in Brasilia, eliminating these councils, preventing regular citizens from participating in these councils, feeding and increasing ethnic and racial discrimination, characterizing indigenous people as backward, as obstacles to development, and trying to kind of resurrect the assimilationist policies that were already discarded, and that were articulated in 1910. So we're going back to policies and ideas that were put forth in the beginning of the 20th century and have already been debunked. And it's hard to believe that today. And kind of sponsoring invasions of lands and violence. We have encroachment and invasions to indigenous lands and also murdering indigenous leadership and rural leadership. So this is the kind of the background, the setting in which we find ourselves. And so now I'd like to articulate an agenda for human rights and environmental justice. And I think one of the first things we need to do to understand this set of circumstances is understand the situation of the planet in this moment. It's the global warming, we have the oceans becoming more acidic, we have the sixth wave of biological extinction, the natural resources are running out, and so this has prompted biologists to talk about a new era that's an Anthropocene era in which human activity is the sole focus of humans, and it is the defining characteristic of the world. And we need to assume responsibility as a human species for the Anthropocene, and recognize that the planetary problems require global solutions, that nationalism and xenophobia impede this process, that the survival of the Earth, of the very Earth, is in jeopardy, and that resilience is a new organizing principle in this struggle. I'd like to talk a little bit about the transnational arenas for public debate and political action that a couple of theorists are talking about. We're talking about a post-national political order in which social movements, globalized social movements, are gaining a political voice, which includes indigenous people and civil society, people and participation in civil society, the United Nations, and also the expansion of the spheres, in other words, the reach of justice over human rights. This is being expanded. Rights of indigenous people, environmental security, and climate justice. This agenda is supported in international movements and statements. Here's some examples of these measures that have been passed. The United Nations passed a law or a measure to preserve indigenous rights, and other examples, as you could see there. But I'd like to talk about something else, which it's at the national level that the human rights are being violated, and that's where we need to inspect and to kind of prevent these things from happening. We can't just wait for the global movement to save us. We have to organize at the national level. And so I'd like to identify 6 areas of priority for action. First, we need to affirm constitutional rights. So the 1988 Constitution has to be our foundation stone, and has to be, because that's where many of the rights that I've talked about are articulated, and we have to not let anyone kind of encroach on that line. Defending territorial rights, at the very least 4, as you can see there, but there are also many more, as like the fisherwomen, as Elionice just spoke about. But indigenous lands, the quilombos, these maroon communities, they need to be protected. They need to be officially recognized. Protected areas for sustainable use, as the HESEX, and sustainable development, and units of conservation as well. Third, local control over the use of natural resources. So we need consent of these communities that is not being regulated in Brazil. It needs to be. We need to have processes of consent before we go in and use these natural resources. We need to recognize the laws of in terms of who's the custodian of these lands. We need to have a sustainable use as the guiding principle of whatever political action that we take. Fourth, we want to guarantee environmental security. Article 225 of the Constitution talks about the right to a healthy and safe environment for everyone. And this is this also needs to be a foundation for our struggle for environmental rights. The disasters in Brumadinho and Rio Doce, they are unacceptable in today's age. They're not natural disasters. They're disasters that are caused by negligence, human negligence, and that threaten the environmental security and also lives of people in these regions. And we need to have a strict system in terms of holding people accountable. And we also need to look at the dangers to urban environments. You're talking about Rio and other cities in which this is a constant factor. Fifth, the protection of cultural and ethnic rights. Fighting against hate, prejudice, and racism, documenting and denouncing violations of human rights, mobilizing public opinion about cultural rights, and I would like to, topple kind of the cultural heritage and inheritance ideas that in other words, I want to expose the cultural richness that exists in Brazil. Sixth, climate justice, which is a question that's going to be talked about more and more. We need to have a more full implementation of the Paris Accords and have more Brazilian involvement in this. We need to expand the networks of information about greenhouse gases and the destruction of ecosystems and take more responsibility in that sense. So what would be the required elements for an alternative form of governance, socio-environmental governance? So my departure point is one of a rights-based approach, as we say in English, which has as its base recognizing the collective rights to a territory, free consent that's informed and done before projects are begun, and participation of average citizens in the decisions about development. We need to have fair and equal treatment of the negative impacts. We need to have, people need to be held accountable, whether they're the World Bank or in China or wherever they may be. We need to have them participate in and take responsibility for the negative impacts, and to mitigate those negative impacts. We need to have distribution of the economic benefits that's done in a way that's equitable, and have everyone have access to these resources. We need to have plans to preserve natural resources and environments. We need to have we need to take the long view when we make these plans, and think about what will the long-term effects of our actions be. And we also need alternatives to the predatory extractivist approach and perspectives. We need to recognize that these resources are not renewable. In other words, it's not sustainable. So we need to control our use of natural resources, and that needs to be part of our discourse. We have to talk about lowering our carbon footprint, and articulating community practices that will be successful and change the policies of commerce and investment. And coming back to this idea of the Anthropocene, because we are all on the same planet, and we will all be affected by these changes. And so we all have to participate in this, in proposing an alternative so that we can stay here in a healthy way on this earth. Thank you.
Does somebody have microphones to collect questions by any chance? Oh, okay. Let's go ahead and start with questions. Questions of anyone who's going to speak in Portuguese, so we don't need any translation. Yeah.
próxima pergunta é sobre uma questão estratégica. Uma das grandes vantagens estratégicas do MST sempre foi
One of the good strategic advantages was facing companies directly. In other words, we have a strategic challenge if we're gonna try and take on the big companies, or if we're gonna try and do this in an economic way, if we're gonna try and fight, if we're gonna march on Brasilia, the country's capital, or if we're gonna do it against specific multinational companies. So this is a constant challenge, and in the last few years, the conflicts have been governmental conflicts. In other words, within the political and governmental context. And so I would like to ask you if you believe that we've come to a moment in which we need to confront companies directly, or if it's going to continue to be a political thing only.
My question is in dialogue with that one. Can he get a microphone, please? Microphone. Hello. My question is going to go in this way. The challenges that you pose, I think that they're challenges about the normative marks, about, above all, the responsibility that enterprises or businesses have with respect to human rights, and also their socio-environmental dimension. So I think this is one of the challenges that has been posed when we're talking about human rights. So there's a need to reaffirm, not necessarily that every violation is done by the state, but that it may also be the direct responsibility of the businesses, that the businesses have been violating, or enterprises have been violating human rights. And I want to ask, how well has this been being established or discussed in terms of Brazilian national law, in terms of society? I think that takes care of or covers the three different subjects that were covered by the panelists. I wanted to take advantage of the presence of Ayala, because she might have spoken about this before, but for me, MST is a maximum, the highest example of social organizing. For me, it's an international paradigm or model that I know in this regard. So because I also go to demonstrations, I've become a bit uncomfortable. I became uncomfortable in São Paulo. Why is it that political manifestations always take place in the center of the city and not in the periphery? I think it has a little bit to do with something that we discussed yesterday. Why do you have to do him no on the central street of the city of São Paulo? And why not on a street in the periphery? It's something that I don't quite understand about the political strategies of the movement. When people speak, as we spoke, as Douglas spoke this morning, about how the politicians need to get closer to the grassroots. So I wanted to ask Ayala, what does she think about that?
Olá, a minha pergunta é para Elionice e Ayala.
Here in the United States, when black folks are engaged in struggle, I'm not speaking in totality, but generally, particularly as of late, with struggles are usually against police aggression, school reform, so on and so forth, things that we would all be familiar with in some kind of way. Sometimes when we talk about struggles that have to do with land, it's not directly connected to food. It's like our communities are being gentrified. These white folks with powerful wealthy interests are able to move in, set up businesses, and because we haven't been able to have wealth and access, you know, we don't have homes and things, and then wealth isn't transferred generationally. But the question about land, as I understood y'all's conversation, it seems very much rooted in like, this is our land, we can track it back to 300 years that we've been here, like we eat here, we live here, we black and this is our land. My question is, what does or what might a pan-black, pan-African solidarity look like for other black folk who are also engaged in this struggle, right? If we think of like the political philosophy, the idea of like solidarity, what might that look like, those solidarity lines? And I'm not saying that they don't already exist. If they do, I would love to hear y'all talk about that. But like, how can black folks here in South Providence connect across language, across culture, who don't have a relationship with the land in the same way, but definitely have a political connection in terms of resisting like 400 or 500 years of like white supremacist oppression, right? This powerful idea, Ayala, that you said about these huge land masses, like that's just a legacy, right? The afterlife of colonialism that we still living with. So I would love to hear y'all sort of like talk about what that is or could look like.
So these are questions which actually are for all of us. I'll begin specifically with MST, the questions for me. I'm going to give the opinion of someone who actually lives on the periphery of big cities. I think that we live, these are perspectives and approaches about how we deal with hegemony as well, the hegemonies that we're dealing with right now. I think we're an organization which it's cross-disciplinary, crosses through many things. We were part of the anti-dictatorship struggle. We also played a particular role in the reopening of Brazil. It's a situation that we lived through in the years of the 1990s. So, and we're also experienced with this whole developmentalist cycle. We also had limits, as we had mentioned before, in trying to deal with this. We've dealt with permanent confrontations inside the movement. And these experiences, which are particular experiences, but they're also collective experiences because we're all part of this organization. And that ended up reconfirming certain perspectives. We made an interpretation that if we wanted to construct a counter-hegemonic struggle, we'd have to also work in the big cities. It's because Brazil is made up of multiple realities, small cities inside the interior, but we have to be where all the subjects who are in dispute for public opinion are. So, but in the classic reading, we are a very particular group, a particular slice of the Brazilian population. So many times the big demonstrations, and many times for MST, we go to Sao Paulo. So it means that those of our members who are in the north or the northeast takes them days to come by bus or however they can get there to participate in some kind of activity in the center of the city of Sao Paulo or the city of Brasilia. So when we're talking about the inverse process, we won't have the visibility or the effect that we would have if we were doing it in a place that was outside the main city. but we're going to do things in the Amazon too. These are things that we have to deal with that are just facts of life. Even though we are various components, we are a national movement, and our survival, the theoretical people who inspire us, we ask them, what should we do? What are the lessons that come from other struggles that came before our struggle about the land? And one of the things that they told us was that we have to institute a national movement. It has to be clearly a national movement so that we can face up to and deal with this logic that's a structural logic in our country. So that's sometimes why we step back a bit to make sure that we have that nationwide construction. These are things that we're still building. I don't know if I explained myself well. These are dimensions that we'll have to deal with. When some questions are coming up now that a few years back were not questions that we dealt with, such as the question of women and leadership of women. This was something that was a bit uncomfortable for some of the leaders in our movement. The racial debate appeared once we understood that the majority of MST is a population in the North and Northeast, and that's a black population. It's same way, the debate about LGBTQ. It came about because people in the LGBTQ understood how struggles over land were also something they should be interested. I think that's the beauty of what we do as a movement, placing new questions before us at the moment or in the moment when they come up. With about the transnational enterprises, I would say that first it starts from our interpretation, our understanding is that agriculture is being taken over in a hegemonic way by these enterprises. You know who were the first people who confronted the question of transnational invasion of our country was March 8th by the women of MST. So we went to academic circles, we went to enterprises, we tried to tell them we're acting in an irrational way. And they wanted to camouflage or to hide what we were doing. We were trying to explain that there was a logic to what was happening in our territory. So women came up with this first on March 8th that year. But now we've understood, and we're raising the point that we don't just call for the government to account for what it's doing, but also that the enterprises have to do that. We did something that had a tremendous impact last year. That what happened was a particular country with social environmental activists put it out and said that this company was doing this in Pará, and it affected so many thousands of families. So these are things that we're experimenting with. These enterprises, these businesses also have to be confronted by us as we deal with environmental questions and with territorial land questions, just like we deal with the central government. Can't hear. Question.
She's asking her to respond to this question.
The debate is very recent with MST. I went into MST as a member to fight about territory. I didn't go in as a racial question. That's what was moving me at first. But with increasing consciousness about class, then I had to understand that I, as a black woman, was a black woman in a peasant movement. So I'm speaking about a personal experience, but I can be pretty sure that I'm speaking about the experience of many comrades who, like me, by the process of struggle for land, began to recognize themselves. We are actually searching for many interpretations and understanding and reflections. How does a peasant movement, how does a land movement, for example, MST in Bahia had to ask the people in Bahia, how do we deal with the race question? Because we thought we were doing a very superficial reading of the race question. Even though race is a structural problem in our country, we know that our ancestors are there. We have to think about how to place them, how to deal with it. So just like we saw that headline that said, nobody was killed. We had not understood that headline from President Bolsonaro, no one was killed. We did not understand. At first, I didn't understand what Bolsonaro meant, but now I understand what he was saying is that those who were killed were nobody. So this is a condition that's being expressed further and further. I think that's the road that you're talking about. We are identified by those things that are inside us, things that identify us by our very bodies, by our ancestry, and also by the challenges that are placed on us because of our physical presence and our historic past. I always hear that whoever is speaking about lots of different things has no basis for speaking about something specific. We have a problem with boxes in our territory. We have a problem with placing things in boxes. My time ran out, but I wanted to say that territorial justice is the same thing as social justice. It has to do with facing up to capital. It has to do with regulations about our territory. It has to do with food security. Responding to the questions that you've posed, we have evaluated or made the evaluation that we need to face up to the government, but that we also need to face up to or confront the enterprises and businesses. We think that the enterprises have the posture or the statue that they have because the government legitimizes what they do. So when there was a change, for example, in the forestry code, that the enterprises, the shrimp farming people were allowed to, their debt was forgiven, that the certain areas stopped being protected areas. We think that the government gave that strength to those enterprises. And those enterprises, for example, about shrimp farming, have had a serious bad impact on our territory. In the Northeast, it's actually been putting fishermen and fisherwomen out of business, out of being able to conduct their lives, out of business of producing. Everybody who's eating captive shrimp or farmed shrimp is contributing to this. So that's why yesterday I didn't eat the salmon because I don't know where that salmon came from. I don't know if that was salmon that was coming from Chile, which is enslaving fishermen and fishermen in Chile, that they're taking away their land and their territory. So if you put yourself out to do a debate on social and environmental justice, you have to be coherent about that. So it's that coherence. Sometimes there's a cynicism in the society that doesn't allow us to be coherent. In our movement of fishermen and fisherwomen in Bahia, we produce. We're working alongside enterprises that are also, we have to deal with enterprises that are against us, that are our enemies. We put in the category of enemies the government as well as the enterprises. This was something that hurt us, it really hurt us and it made us feel bad. Sometimes the intellectual acting, a kind of a dominant way that the intellectuals act makes us feel kind of restricted in how we can formulate ideas that contribute to the panel. Some people ask things like, is this a subaltern that's trying to speak? And so that kind of acting in a dominant way prevents us from reflecting well on these questions. But we're doing it anyway, and we will continue to do it. We are doing it, we will continue to do it. We're facing up to the government, we're facing up to the Brazilian state, because this policy is not just a policy of the Bolsonaro government. It is a state decision, the Brazilian state. We need to be clear. It is the state. It is a state that exterminates people. It's a state that doesn't respect the specificity, the particularities of each of the parts of the population. We also have to confront the enterprises. They get their titles, they get their permission because they're supposed to take on certain responsibilities. What we have to say is that these enterprises are not acting responsibly, And in trying to respond to the other question, there's an attempt to convince us that the territories that we are in are not the ideal territories where we should live. Since I've been a little child, I've been hearing that traditional fishing can in no way be successful, and that we need to find other ways to live. And with all due respect to the favela, to the ghetto, to the periphery, in my community, I am Elionice Sacramento. I am the granddaughter of, I am the great-granddaughter, I am the great-great-granddaughter. People know me. I sleep and eat whether I have money or not. In the capital city, I'm just a number. I'm just a face. So we need to understand that when capital tries to convince us that our place where we live is not viable, it's because they want to install themselves in our place. Then, contrary to what capital says, people work because we want to buy a boat. Capital wants to work so they can buy a boat or a beach house. We already have a house at the beach. So when we have almost nothing in our house to eat, we have shrimp, we have shellfish, we have fish night and day. On the other hand, our ancestors were born and became ancestors, grew up and became ancestors in this territory. That has importance for us. We have a knowledge. This is a knowledge that cannot be acquired in the academy, in the university. Our life is regulated by the waves, by the tides, by the moon. We know how to fish based on the balancing of the waves. Capital will not be able to take that from us. So if the international community, the international partners want to help us in a certain way, they have to also pressure the Brazilian government so that our territories are reevaluated, so that we have the right to live and die in the same territories where our ancestors lived and died. Also, you could amplify our denunciations about what's happening in our territory. This is some very important support that you could give, because we are not going to leave our territory. We live there every day in fear. People ask me sometimes if I am afraid. I am afraid. But it's not a fear that paralyzes me. It's not a fear that will make me want to leave home. It's a fear that will make me go further in struggle. It's a fear that pushes me along for the struggle. That's the fear that I see pushing everybody who's a fisherman and a fisherwoman along every seashore and on the banks of every river.
I'd like to touch on the question about enterprises. My talk, obviously, I talked about public policy and rights, but the question is whether enterprises and companies should enter this debate, and the response is the answer is yes. So they have responsibilities. They need to, we need to kind of hold them accountable. Let me give an example. The Amazon Watch organization, which is responsible for denouncing violations in the Amazon, they use this tactic of putting together and protesting, in front of specific companies. So when there's a meeting to make decisions about these enterprises, they'll go and protest, and they'll keep people from going into these meetings and make people uncomfortable, in the face of potential decisions that might harm the Amazon. And that's one of the tactics that we have seen. So on the other hand, there's a concept of social responsibility that supposedly these various enterprises and companies are fulfilling, but the fact that they're not keeping their word and they're not fulfilling their part of the bargain is a problem, and we need to highlight that. We can make we have to hold them accountable, and yes, we do have to try and tackle this from the political perspective and also directly protesting against the enterprises. Muito obrigado. Thank you for your talks, your great talks. I would like to talk about and ask about movements that may already be happening in Brazil with regard to what you've already talked about. And for example, we saw last week the incredible movement of scientists here in the U.S. and people protesting the planned celebration of Bolsonaro's presidency, and we're going to continue to pressure these organizations to not celebrate Bolsonaro. But a lot of questions work on environmental questions, and they talk about public policy and things and in these structures that are in place. But we also need to kind of recognize that the companies that are behind these events, they should also be the target of these protests, and we can't allow them to reward people for exploiting these resources. And so one of the questions that I have is with society here, if we have a great opportunity. Sonia Guajajara was here yesterday, and she through video, and she we have this opportunity to be in New York next week and to pressure and to show up and to make these companies uncomfortable and try and hold them accountable. And so we're going to continue that work here. But in Brazil, how do you guys view, or what do you guys think about how can this be done in a way that will create a greater consciousness in the population's mind? So not only in the way that you talked about in terms of boycotting things, the products that are the result of this this environmental degradation and exploitation, in terms of these territories and groups that are exploited to bring these products to the market, but also in terms of trying to take this information to a greater public and a greater audience. So then that would make the boycotts or anything else more effective. I'd also like to add a question here. I'd like to know, first of all, thank you very much. For all three of you, your talks were great. I would like to know what you think about two types of action that we in our New York collective have been thinking about. And I'm wondering if you think this would have an impact on local questions. So one is, we've seen, for example, recently persecution of indigenous leaders. We got the name of a local representative, the representative who's actually threatening him there, and we called him and we sent him faxes to his personal number, and I spoke with him. I spoke to his office there, and I said, "Look, I'm calling from New York. I live here. I just want you to know that I saw what's on the Folha de São Paulo newspaper. I know you're persecuting this indigenous chief, and I know what's going on." And so I'm wondering if you think that kind of personal involvement is effective. What do you think of boycotting products from if there's a way to effectively organize boycotts?
I want to thank the event's organizers for bringing these three precious jewels. My question is for Ayala. Because she mentioned several times the fact that the racial question that she only just a little while ago in MS, she's just been in MST for a short while. And the question the question of the American who asked this question, he asked about Pan-Africanism. And so I'm asking, how do you analyze the fact that MST has taken so long? And here I'm speaking about Pan-Africanism, because in 2007, 17, there was a big meeting about Pan-Africanism as a form of articulating or linking together better MST with racial, the racial question, and with respect to political struggle. There was a big, great economist from Zambia who gave us a beautiful reflection about Marxism. And my son, who was 20 years old, he said, okay, I've learned about Marxism. I'm glad that I went with him. And so I want to know, how are you thinking about this question with respect to MST when it was born on the eve of the Constitution 1988? All the debate was taking place in rural Black communities. And then MST arises or emerges, and I could be mistaken, but MST did not incorporate that debate, those discussions coming from rural Black communities, and also for some of the Maroon or quilombola communities. So in the first moment, it seemed that it was a movement of the South and whites in the South. And so we're thinking that this great population, this great possibility of people all over the country who are not white have to be incorporated. So it can't just be an organization that has an appearance of whiteness. So I wanted to know, what do you think about this? Whether the MST as an organization needs a more systematic reflection to find a political practice that incorporates, in fact, the racial question in the struggle for land inside the movement of rural workers or landless people. Thank you.
I don't have a lot to say. Just wanted to talk about the boycott, and I think that's a great idea that you are, calling and sending faxes to the representatives there. It's a form of putting pressure on them that is possible today, that wasn't possible not too long ago. And I would like to highlight again this new space, this new transnational space for pressure. We have to be very creative, and we have to use all of the possible mechanisms and ways to put pressure on people to denounce, to increase visibility, and to let the world know what's happening. So with respect to the boycott, it's a little bit more complicated because it would require wider and a really strong organization. In other words, we need to kind of spread the word, and it needs to spread in a way that is actually impactful. So I can think of, the boycott in South Africa in the 80s that were effective. And the farm workers boycott here in the 70s and 60s. In other words, the boycott is important and powerful tool, but it's a weapon that needs to be very well articulated and strategized, and it needs to have enough support so that it is successful.
So, about broadening the debate, in about 2007, we did an action or an activity linking the Northeast, all around the Northeast, to struggle against or to think about shrimp farming. We had commercial shrimp farming. It was something that went beyond just taking over our territory. It went beyond an attack to traditional fishing. we had a situation where the militia had actually killed several fishermen and fisherwomen to maintain or to make it possible for shrimp farming to go forward in our territory. So we organized some meetings to discuss the impact of the creation of captive shrimp or shrimp farming. The artists of the Northeast mobilized. They created music, songs, poetry. We did festivals. And we built something that was called the Cry of Fortaleza. 10 reasons to not eat shrimp farmed or farmed shrimp, commercially farmed shrimp. We talked about how it is bad for the environment, it's bad for health, all the whole set of bad impacts. And after that, what we managed to do, we managed that shrimp farming was prohibited, that there were no new licenses given to do shrimp farming in Brazil. We succeeded in broadening the debate with a certain charter, but also with a whole set of other instruments. We had to dialogue with people other than ourselves. And after that came the change to the forestry code. So there was an important activity around that. But this possibility is very important. We need to discover mechanisms, efficient mechanisms, to dialogue with the whole society with respect to this. And we've understood that when people become aware that it is also their own lives at risk, then they become co-responsible for the situation. The things that we're placing before them, they also take responsibility. So the campaign, a wide campaign, is very important. Now, what we need support, we need partnerships, many partnerships. We need the partnership of professionals who know different things, because unfortunately, our society is a society that's still held back or restrained by what is argued formally. So my arguments, even although I argue them in a very coherent way, they're not necessarily accepted. So we have to bring together different types of arguments so that we can make a better argument for the whole society. With respect to direct action to support us, I think that they're extremely important. We, for example, have a place called the Quilombo dos Rios Macacos. It is one of the most heavily attacked. They've been having serious attacks from the Navy, the Brazilian Navy. For the past few years, many different kinds of violations of their human rights have taken place. I'm not sure if it's possible to imagine that what's happening to them is actually happening. And we received, for example, the visit from Professor Jeri Augusta Brown. She came to Bahia and she collaborated with the founding of that School of the Waters. And she asked us how could she collaborate. And we told her, you have to help us denounce these violations, things that would make the Brazilian government more sensitive. So what happened was the Brazilian government received this rain of cards, letters coming from students in the United States at Brown, and we were able to have certain advances because of that. Because what happens is that in Brazil, they're very concerned about what people outside might be thinking about Brazil. Unfortunately, what we think about ourselves is not considered quite as important. But if the international society starts to understand that Brazil is a violator of human rights, that it's for example, we're a left government, but we're acting in an incoherent way, then this has repercussions. I've been speaking with the professor at home about different things that are happening currently in Conceição. Supposedly, we have a leftist government in the state of Bahia, but we would be able to push the state government in Bahia if, for example, the state government received complaints from an external organization or activity. So if something comes, that kind of external pressure. I love Brazil. It's where I'm going to live and die, but that's the face that our country has right now. Colonialism is still strong in Brazil, and the current government is trying to widen that colonialism.
I'd like to go along this line with what Elionice said to you, and you know, so raising consciousness about society of what's happening, and to help society realize that these fields, these lands are also theirs, and that these people that live off the land and the water and the animals, and that even those who live in the cities or in other urban spaces, you know, they would have trouble surviving if our way of life was threatened, because everyone needs to eat, and food, as you know, national surveys have and official surveys have shown, they're products from the hand, you know, that come from the hands of peasants, of fishers, of indigenous people. It's not the big companies that do this, that they produce this food. And so I think it's a really important effort that we need to make. So the effort of the MST has been trying to show that we also produce food. And that, you know, if you're going to get food from us, it's diverse, it's healthy. Whereas if you're going to get from companies, they also produce food, but it's bad for you. It's you know, it's toxic. And so we want to try to differentiate our production from their production and be able to offer what our country has, the best our country has, to society at large. And so I think we've constructed markets for people to go and buy our products, and in that way, we try to increase our visibility and help people see that we are directly tied to the food that they eat, the healthy food that they eat. And so we've tried to make this process more visible, because big companies sometimes get what we produce and then they sell it and try and pass it off as theirs. But we want to help people know what's actually going on. And so commercializing production is a challenge, and we know that it's a challenge that we're facing in Brazil and all over the world. But it's the same all over the world in terms of the production comes from peasants and other people who are exploited, and we can't give up before we denounce those who are committing abuses. We can't accept defeat before we even try. What you call, mechanisms of denunciation. I remember when I was starting out in the MST that we would say, we want to scare, or we want to make visible the death threats that we're receiving, and show people that, look, if we die, then you will also be harmed by that. And so these are mechanisms, these are strategies for survival, for agrarian reform, and regardless of the context, it was a daily fight for survival and for guaranteeing our right to life. And in terms of solidarity, international solidarity, it's fundamental in this struggle, this daily struggle. So whether you call it, what you call denunciation and other things, we always have called it the beginning. We've called it solidarity. Those are all kind of encompassed in solidarity. That's what we've always called it. And, kind of denouncing governments that are responsible, that are co-responsible for these abuses. And, for example, Norwegian companies, we want to show that they also are affecting the Amazon because they're investing in companies that are deforesting and that are exploiting the natural resources. So helping people understand their involvement in these processes will allow us to, save the lives of those who are working in those areas, and those in other spaces as well. So to finish up, I'd like to say the following. I don't think it's the MST that was late in bringing up the racial question or the gender question or ethnicity question. I think it was the left, the Brazilian left. I'm from a generation in which people said that, the important thing was to topple capitalism, and then we'd look at other agendas. And this Representative Fernandes, he wrote in the Constitution, and when they were developing the Constitution and they were talking about the racial question, I read this. I don't know. I was a little younger. But I read it after, and they're talking about this racial struggle on the left, and he wrote a letter from the party asking forgiveness, but he said, my relationship with the black movement prevents me from advancing the demands of the MST movement. So I'm gonna stick with the black movement here, because if I follow the MST's demands, it can have really disastrous consequences. And so, we're trying to kind of unify all these different projects, all these different fronts. So, but the left as a whole, and of course, we are part of the left, and we're a movement in it, a peasant movement. We suffer the consequences of making these questions secondary, and that today we're trying to make primary questions in terms of race and ethnicity, or rather, we're trying to face capital isn't an abstract thing; it's a concrete thing. So if we are fighting against racism or chauvinism or anything, the prejudice and the bias, homophobia, if we're standing up to that, we're standing up to capital. And so I think raising consciousness was not just something that happened with the MST now or recently. It's the result of very concrete movements, and it is something that's true of the left in general. So the right has been provoking us, but also the left has been we've been trying to raise consciousness and make people understand that these questions are just as important as capital, that land and the racial question are crucial questions and issues that we need to focus on, and we need to kind of educate people about the importance of this. And I'd like to, I wasn't at the opening session, but I've heard a lot about it, and people have been talking a lot about hope and about struggle and et cetera. And what I would like to read is João Pedro ended sharing part of a letter that he'd received, a university professor in Ceará, and he wrote this letter when he went to Pará, this study, and this letter rather. And so I don't know if you're aware, but Delaide was one of the first professors to be the victim of attacks and other prejudice from those kind of criticizing and attacking our movement. So she was, kind of demonstrators were cursing them out from the moment that João Pedro arrived at the airport to the event. They were constantly attacked and belittled, and sometimes the only language that we have, the only language that they understand is the language of violence. But I would like to say that what Professor Adelaide, when she was afraid, but we kept calling her, saying, "Come on, come participate in these activities, come see what we've been experiencing recently." So she wrote after this experience, "Dear João Pedro, I arrived yesterday after three days in the S-curve. And there was a massacre. This is where the massacre of indigenous people happened in '96. And I participated in the MST, the 14th camp. And there I experienced what Boffy has said about it in another context, that it is as if we were bathing in the waters of the future. Children without land, they kind of helped us gain consciousness of the problems that are here. And I talked with a few people that were present at that massacre in '96, and I saw the potential of memory as a substratus, as a foundation for the fight for liberty. On my journey, I experienced things that called into question my own humanity and made me reflect about it. I visited cemeteries and memorials made in honor of those who were massacred. Antonio Calado talks about a dialogue he had, and he talked to Pedro. He said, "What do you think about this people? What do you think this people are looking for?" And of course, the answer would be land. He thought, but the answer was actually what they most want is peace. So I slept there in Marlene's house, and I saw with my own eyes and with my heart that they plant, they raise animals, they reap, and they have such great peace in their house. Marlene became a professor, and she loves the school where she works, in the community school. I came back with something very fixed in my mind, that the MST, in its 35 years of existence, has had constant dedication to cultivating memory as a powerful tool. I met a lot of great people there and a lot of power women there. Sincerely, Adelaide. So I'd like to say that hope can only be reaffirmed when we are capable of constructing it, not only as individuals in the world, but as a collective group in the world, and we have faith and brotherhood. Thank you.
So, before we conclude, in fact, I want to ask the moderator for permission to just have 5 minutes. A Bahian 5 minutes or an American 5 minutes? Okay, 5 American minutes to think along with her about hope and the current conjuncture. We, the people of, the fishing people, are considered people of the waters. And we are regulated, our life is regulated by 2 tides, the big tide and the small tide. In the big tide, we have productivity, a big productivity in terms of diversity and quantity. So the big tide is extremely important and strategic in fishing territories. But the small tide is a period when we protect fishing territories so that there can be reproduction of fish, so that there can be a guarantee that we have the chance to rest so we don't get sick so much. And it makes it possible for us to wage struggle. In the big tides, because those are productive ones, political struggle can't be done. And so the evaluation, the assessment that we make as fishermen and fisherwomen is that we feel the government, but we live the big tides. So we think about production, we think about our stomachs, we think about consumption. Now we have an opportunity to live in the small tide. That's the tide that makes it possible for us to struggle. That's the tide that prepares the territory for struggle. And it always comes. And so our strategic task is to take advantage of this small tide that we're living through right now. If we don't have the capacity, strategic capacity, to take advantage of the small tide so that we can wage struggle, so that we can do small revolutions, the ones that we dreamed of doing, what we're living will not make sense. The times we're living through won't make sense. But on the other hand, we're living through a phenomenon that for us has not been explicit or explained in the fishing world. Sometimes we're dealing now with 2 simultaneous big tides and 2 simultaneous small tides. So it could be that this small tide is not going to finish in the time period that we would want her to finish, but she will end. And what we need to do, in fact, is to take advantage of the opportunity that this small tide is providing for us. And with this, I want to say that we, the people of the waters, we understand a lot of things about the conjuncture. Because if we dare to go out to sea to get our food, you have to think about the time and the wind. So long live the waters of Bahia. Long live the waters of the north, of the northeast, the waters of Brazil, and the waters of strategic alliances. Long live all these waters.